The made-up song my kids invented helped police find them. The detective played the 911 recording for me 3 times before I understood what I was hearing. My daughters Maya and Sophie singing their nonsense song in the background, while a man's voice calmly reported a gas leak at an address I didn't recognize. The song they'd been singing obsessively for 2 weeks. Pickle jar, 7 steps to the cookie star, left through the garden door, pickle jar forevermore. The detective asked if the song meant anything to me. I told her my girls had invented it during a rainy afternoon when they were bored. They sang it constantly. In the car, at dinner, before bed. I'd asked them to stop a dozen times because it was driving me insane. Now that annoying melody was the only reason police knew my daughters were still alive. The 911 call had come from a burner phone at 3:47 a.m. The caller claimed to be reporting a gas leak, but dispatch noticed children singing in the background. The address he gave didn't match any gas service calls. When officers arrived, they found an abandoned house. No gas leak, no children. But the recording existed and someone had wanted police to hear my daughters' voices. My ex-husband Trevor had taken the girls for his court-mandated weekend visitation on Friday afternoon. He was supposed to return them Sunday evening at 6. When 7 o'clock came and went with no sign of them, I started calling. His phone went straight to voicemail. I called his apartment. No answer. I called his mother, who said she hadn't heard from him in weeks. By 8, I was in my car driving to his place. The apartment was dark and locked. His car was gone. I called the police. They took a report but said custody disputes weren't emergencies. A parent taking their own children during legal visitation wasn't kidnapping. They'd file a report. Follow up on Monday. I should try to stay calm. But every instinct I had was screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. 2 years ago, Trevor and I had divorced after I discovered he'd been hiding a gambling addiction that had destroyed our savings. The lying had been worse than the debt. He'd looked me in the eye every day and told me elaborate stories about where money was going while secretly losing everything we had at underground poker games. The divorce was ugly. Trevor fought for custody out of spite rather than genuine interest in parenting. He'd never been particularly involved with Maya and Sophie when we were married. But once I filed for divorce, he suddenly wanted 50-50 custody. The judge saw through it and gave him supervised visitation every other weekend. Trevor was furious. He'd showed up drunk to the first 3 visits, missed the next 2 entirely. By the 6th month, he'd settled into a pattern of taking the girls for his allotted time and returning them with expensive gifts he couldn't afford and stories about the amazing father-daughter adventures they'd had. Maya, who was 8, would report that they'd mostly watch TV at his apartment while he played online poker. Sophie, who was 6, would cry about being hungry because Daddy forgot to buy groceries. I'd documented everything, kept detailed records for the custody modification hearing scheduled for next month. Trevor knew he was about to lose even his minimal visitation rights. Monday morning, I called the detective assigned to my case. Detective Lauren Vega listened to my concerns about Trevor's gambling, his anger about losing custody, his increasingly erratic behavior. She said she'd put out a welfare check request for the girls, asked if Trevor had family out of state. I told her his parents were both deceased. He had a brother in Nevada he hadn't spoken to in years. No other family that I knew of. She asked about friends or associates who might help him hide the children. I couldn't think of anyone. Trevor's gambling had isolated him from most people in his life. His poker buddies weren't the kind of people who'd risk harboring fugitive children. Detective Vega said she'd check financial records, see if Trevor had made any large withdrawals or purchases that might indicate where he'd gone. She promised to call with updates. I spent Monday calling schools, hospitals, anywhere the girls might turn up. Nothing. They'd vanished. The 911 call came in early Thursday morning. Detective Vega called me at dawn to play the recording. A man's voice reported a gas leak at 4129 Riverside Road. The dispatcher asked for his name. He said Thomas Cooper. Asked if anyone was in the house. He said no. Place was abandoned. He'd been walking his dog and smelled gas near the property. Then the dispatcher heard children singing. Asked if someone was with him. The man said no, must be kids playing nearby. The singing got louder. Pickle jar, 7 steps to the cookie star. The dispatcher asked him to wait while she dispatched emergency services. The line went dead. Officers arrived at the address within 10 minutes, found a boarded-up house scheduled for demolition. No gas leak, no signs of recent occupation, no children. But someone had wanted police to hear that song. Detective Vega asked if the melody or lyrics meant anything specific, any code or hidden message. I listened again. The song was exactly as my daughters had been singing it for 2 weeks. They'd made it up one Saturday afternoon when I wouldn't let them have cookies before dinner. Maya had started chanting cookie jar in this annoying sing-song voice. Sophie had changed it to pickle jar because she thought pickles were funnier than cookies. Then they'd added the nonsense about 7 steps and garden doors. It became their thing. They'd sing it constantly, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in rounds. They'd made up hand motions, little dances. It had driven me absolutely insane. Now that stupid song was evidence my daughters were alive and trying to communicate. But what were they trying to say? Detective Vega asked if the address meant anything. Riverside Road. I'd never heard of it. She said it was in an industrial area on the outskirts of town, mostly abandoned buildings and empty lots, not residential, not somewhere children would be playing. Detective Vega's team analyzed the 911 recording. The call had been placed from a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 3 days ago. Security footage showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses buying the phone. Average height and build. Nothing distinctive. The voice on the recording had been disguised. Analysis suggested the caller had used a voice modulator app, but the children's singing was clear and authentic. Forensic audio experts confirmed the voices matched recordings I provided of Maya and Sophie from recent family videos. The girls had definitely been present when that call was made. But where? And who was the man? Detective Vega asked if the voice sounded like Trevor even with the distortion. I listened again. Couldn't tell. The modulation made it impossible to recognize. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Spent every moment analyzing that song for meaning. Pickle jar, 7 steps to the cookie star, left, right, left through the garden door, pickle jar forevermore. What were they trying to tell me? 7 steps to what? Left, right, left was a marching pattern. Through the garden door. Was there a garden somewhere? A door they'd seen? I called Detective Vega with theories. She listened patiently to each one, assigned officers to investigate. 7 could be an address number, a room number, a distance. Left, right, left could be directions. Turn left, then right, then left. The garden door could be literal or symbolic. Every theory led nowhere. Meanwhile, the media had picked up the story. Missing children. Custody dispute gone wrong. The 911 call with the haunting song playing in the background. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. My face was all over the news looking exhausted and terrified. Perfect victim material. Trevor's bank records showed no activity since Friday afternoon when he'd withdrawn $300 from an ATM near his apartment. His credit cards hadn't been used. His phone was turned off. His car was missing. Police issued an Amber Alert with photos of Maya and Sophie. Description of Trevor's vehicle. Tips started flooding in. Someone saw them at a gas station in Oregon. Another sighting at a rest stop in Idaho. None of them checked out. Detective Vega said most Amber Alert tips were well-meaning but wrong. People wanted to help so badly they convinced themselves they'd seen the missing children. Every false lead wasted time and resources. Meanwhile, the real trail was going cold. Wherever Trevor had taken my daughters, he'd planned it carefully enough to avoid detection for nearly a week. That level of premeditation terrified me. This wasn't an impulsive decision. He'd been planning to take them and disappear. My mother arrived from across the state to stay with me. She'd never liked Trevor. Had warned me about him when we first started dating. Said something about him felt off. I'd dismissed her concerns as maternal overprotection. Now I wished I'd listened. She held me while I cried, made me eat, answered the phone when reporters called, kept me functional when all I wanted to do was collapse. She'd brought photos of Maya and Sophie from when they were babies. We sat together looking at them. Their first birthdays, first days of school, Halloween costumes, Christmas mornings, all the moments Trevor had missed because he'd been at poker games or sleeping off hangovers. My mother asked how I'd missed the signs. I told her the same thing I'd told myself 1,000 times. He'd been good at hiding it. The lying had been sophisticated. By the time I discovered the truth, we were married with 2 children, and I'd been trying to save the family. Trying to believe his promises that he'd quit gambling, that he'd get help, that things would be different. The second 911 call came 6 days after the first. Same burner phone, different address. This time the man reported a fire at a warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. Said he'd seen smoke coming from the building while driving past. Dispatcher sent fire trucks and police. Officers arrived to find no fire, no smoke, no activity. But again, in the background of the 911 recording, my daughters singing their song, this time with slight variations. Pickle jar, 9 steps to the cookie star, left, right, left through the garden door, blue car, pickle jar forevermore. Detective Vega played the recording. I heard the changes immediately. 7 steps had become 9 steps, and they'd added blue car repeated twice. They were trying to communicate something, giving us information. But what did 9 steps mean? What blue car? Detective Vega's team expanded their analysis. The 2 addresses from the 911 calls were plotted on a map. Both were in industrial areas, abandoned or soon-to-be demolished buildings, roughly 3 miles apart. No obvious connection between the locations, but someone was choosing these specific addresses for a reason. The tech team worked on the burner phone, tried to track its location when not in use, found that it was being kept powered off except during the calls. Sophisticated counter-surveillance. Whoever was making these calls understood how phone tracking worked. That suggested someone with technical knowledge or criminal experience. Neither description fit Trevor. He could barely figure out how to use his smartphone. Someone else was involved. That realization sent ice through my veins. My ex-husband had partnered with someone to abduct our children. I spent hours studying maps of the areas where the 911 calls had been placed. Industrial Boulevard, Riverside Road. Mostly empty buildings waiting for demolition or redevelopment. Abandoned warehouses, defunct factories, not places you'd take children unless you were hiding them. Detective Vega assigned officers to search every abandoned structure within a 5-mile radius of both addresses. They found homeless encampments, drug dens, squatters. No sign of Trevor or my daughters. The searches were thorough but covered enormous amounts of territory. Hundreds of buildings, thousands of potential hiding places. We were looking for 2 small children and an adult in an urban wasteland. The odds were crushing. But the 911 calls meant someone wanted the girls to be found. Someone was helping them communicate. Unless that someone was playing a sick game, using my daughters' voices to torment me while keeping them hidden. My best friend Carla came by every evening after work, brought food I wouldn't eat, sat with me while I obsessively replayed the 911 recordings, listened to me analyze every word of the Pickle Jar song. She'd known Maya and Sophie since they were born, had been there through the divorce, had warned me that Trevor's behavior during custody battles suggested something darker than just vindictiveness. She'd been right, but I hadn't wanted to believe my ex-husband was capable of this level of cruelty. Carla helped me maintain some structure, made me shower, made me change clothes, reminded me that I needed to be functional when the girls came home. Not if. When. Her certainty helped me believe it was possible, that this nightmare would end with my daughters safe in my arms. The break came from an unexpected source, a homeless man named Eugene who lived in one of the abandoned warehouses near Industrial Boulevard. He'd been picked up for questioning during the searches. Told police he'd seen a man with 2 young girls entering a building 3 blocks from where the second 911 call was placed. Said the man seemed nervous. The girls looked scared. Eugene had noticed because children didn't usually come to that area. He'd watched them go into an old printing factory that had been empty for years. Police rushed to the location, found the building locked and seemingly empty. But thermal imaging from outside showed heat signatures on the second floor. 3 people, 2 small, 1 adult-sized. Detective Vega called me, said they'd found them. Were preparing to breach the building. Told me to stay on the line but not to speak. I heard radio chatter, orders being given, then shouting, footsteps pounding, a door breaking, more shouting, then silence, then Detective Vega's voice. We have them. The girls are safe. I drove to the scene in a blur. Police had cordoned off the building. Ambulances were waiting. I saw Sophie first. A paramedic was carrying her out. She was crying, dirty but seemingly unharmed. Then Maya, walking on her own but clutching a female officer's hand. Both girls saw me at the same moment and screamed, "Mommy!" I ran to them, held them, checked them for injuries. Maya had a bruise on her arm. Sophie's clothes were filthy. Both were dehydrated and exhausted, but alive. The paramedics insisted on transporting them to the hospital for evaluation. I rode in the ambulance with them. Maya kept talking, telling me everything that had happened. Sophie just held my hand and cried. At the hospital, they were examined thoroughly. No signs of sexual abuse, no serious injuries. Mostly they needed food, water, rest, and reassurance. The doctor said they'd been through trauma but would physically recover. Detective Vega arrived at the hospital with questions. She was gentle but thorough. Maya told her everything. Trevor had picked them up on Friday as planned. Told them they were going on an adventure. Drove them around for hours. Stopped at a motel where a man was waiting. Someone Maya had never seen before. The man's name was Glenn. He was Trevor's poker buddy. Trevor owed him a lot of money. They'd made a deal. Trevor would help Glenn with something and the debt would be erased. That something was holding Maya and Sophie in the abandoned building while Trevor disappeared. Glenn would keep the girls hidden for 2 weeks, then release them unharmed. Trevor would be long gone by then. The plan was to hurt me, make me suffer while Trevor escaped his debts and his custody problems simultaneously. Glenn had agreed because he thought holding children for 2 weeks would be easy money. He didn't realize they'd be so difficult to control. Maya explained how they'd come up with the plan to get help. Glenn had one of those emergency medical alert buttons, the kind elderly people wear. He'd shown it to them. Said if they tried to escape or make noise, he'd press the button and people would come. But Maya realized the button was connected to a phone. Glenn had to call 911 manually using a burner phone he kept in his pocket. She'd watched him order food delivery, heard him making calls. Sophie and Maya had started singing their Pickle Jar song constantly, driving Glenn crazy, making him so annoyed he'd do anything to shut them up. They'd sing it for hours, get louder whenever he told them to stop. Glenn had threatened them, but they kept singing. Finally, he'd made a deal. If they stayed quiet during certain times, he'd let them sing during other times. The girls had agreed. Then they'd sung their song during his 911 calls. Added clues. 7 steps meant they'd climbed 7 steps to the room they were in. 9 steps meant they'd been moved to a different floor up 9 steps. Blue car was Glenn's car parked outside the building. Details they hoped someone would understand. Detective Vega asked why Glenn made the 911 calls at all. Maya said Glenn was paranoid about the building, worried it might actually have a gas leak or fire. He'd been calling in fake reports to get authorities to check the structure without revealing he was inside. He wanted to make sure the building wasn't going to collapse or catch fire while he was hiding there with them. The calls were about his own safety. He'd been furious when he realized dispatch might have heard the girls singing, threatened them. But Maya had convinced him the song was just nonsense, nothing that would mean anything to anyone. Glenn had believed her because he was stupid. That's what Maya said. He was really, really stupid, Mom. He thought we were just annoying. He didn't know we were telling you where we were. I held my daughter and cried. She'd been so brave, so clever. 8 years old, and she'd figured out how to communicate through a song, to hide messages in plain sight while their captor thought it was meaningless noise. The police arrested Glenn Murphy at the abandoned printing factory. He'd tried to run when they breached the building but was caught within minutes. Searched his car and found the burner phone, evidence of the 911 calls, and a notebook detailing his agreement with Trevor. Glenn would hold the girls for 14 days. Trevor would pay him $20,000 when he returned from wherever he'd disappeared to. Plus, Trevor's existing $40,000 gambling debt would be forgiven. Glenn had thought it was easy money. Hold 2 kids in an empty building for 2 weeks. Feed them. Keep them quiet. Collect $60 grand total. He hadn't anticipated how difficult and terrifying it would be to actually imprison children, or how clever they'd be, or how their constant singing would drive him to the edge of sanity. When police questioned him, he broke immediately, gave them everything, told them Trevor had planned this for months, had deliberately lost more money to Glenn to create the debt that would motivate the abduction. Trevor's plan had been sophisticated. He'd gradually increased his gambling losses to Glenn specifically, built up a debt so large it would pressure Glenn to agree to something criminal. Then Trevor had proposed the scheme. Glenn holds the girls while Trevor vanishes. After 2 weeks, Glenn releases them unharmed, says he found them wandering, claims he was protecting them. Trevor is long gone and can't be questioned. Glenn gets paid and his debt is cleared. No one can prove Glenn knew about the abduction. The girls are too young to testify coherently. It would look like Trevor took his daughters and abandoned them, not kidnapping. Just a desperate father making bad choices. The song had been their lifeline, a way to communicate that seemed innocent enough to get past Glenn's minimal supervision, but specific enough to give police information. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. Trevor had been planning this for at least 6 months. Bank records showed he'd been systematically losing money to Glenn at poker games, held in the back room of a bar on the east side. Other players confirmed Trevor had been betting recklessly, making stupid plays, losing hands he should have won. At first, they thought he was just bad at poker. Then they realized he was losing on purpose, building a debt to one specific person. Glenn Murphy was known in the gambling community as someone who'd do anything for money. He'd been arrested twice for loan sharking, once for assault. He had connections to organized crime. Was exactly the kind of person who'd agree to hold children for cash. Trevor had chosen his accomplice carefully. The manhunt for Trevor intensified. His truck was found abandoned at a bus station in Montana. Security footage showed him boarding a bus to Vancouver. Canadian authorities were notified. Trevor was arrested trying to cross the border into the United States 2 days later. He'd spent a week in Canada before running out of money. Tried to come back to liquidate assets. Border Patrol flagged him based on the Amber Alert. He was extradited back to face charges: kidnapping, child endangerment, conspiracy. The prosecutor said he'd seek the maximum sentence. Trevor's public defender tried to argue he was a desperate father driven by unfair custody arrangements. The judge wasn't buying it. Trevor had paid someone to hold his daughters captive in an abandoned building, had traumatized them for his own benefit, had chosen gambling debts over their safety and well-being. There was no mitigating circumstance that would excuse those choices. Maya and Sophie came home from the hospital after 2 days of observation. The pediatrician prescribed counseling and provided referrals to child psychologists who specialized in trauma. The first week home was difficult. The girls wouldn't sleep in their own rooms. We all slept together in my bed. They woke up screaming from nightmares. Maya kept asking if Daddy was coming back, if Glenn had escaped, if they were safe. I reassured them constantly, but my own fear was palpable. What if there were other people involved? What if Glenn had partners who wanted revenge? Detective Vega assigned a patrol car to drive past our house every few hours, gave me her personal cell number, told me to call anytime, day or night, if anything seemed wrong. The security helped but couldn't eliminate the fear. Sophie stopped singing completely, wouldn't even hum along to music on the radio. The therapist said she'd associated singing with the trauma, with being held captive, with trying to signal for help while terrified. It would take time for her to reclaim music as something joyful. Maya went the opposite direction, became obsessed with communication systems, emergency protocols, ways to call for help. She wanted to learn Morse code, sign language, ham radio operation. The therapist said she was trying to regain control, to prepare herself in case something bad happened again. Both reactions were normal trauma responses, Both would require patient, professional intervention to address. The media circus intensified after the girls were found. News trucks camped outside our house. Reporters knocked on our door at all hours. Wanted interviews, photos, exclusive stories. I refused all of them. Told them to leave my family alone. Some respected that boundary. Others didn't. One particularly aggressive reporter approached Maya while she was playing in our fenced backyard, yelled questions at her over the fence. Maya ran inside crying. I called the police. Detective Vega came personally, threatened the reporter with harassment charges. The news trucks finally left, but the damage was done. Maya was terrified of being outside, afraid strangers would grab her, ask her questions, take her picture. Our home had been violated again, this time by people who claimed to care about the story but cared more about ratings and clicks. I hired a lawyer to handle media requests and protect our privacy. She sent cease and desist letters to outlets that had published photos of the girls without permission. Negotiated with the prosecutor's office to keep certain evidence sealed to protect Maya and Sophie's identities as much as possible. Filed motions to have their testimony recorded privately, rather than in open court. The legal fees were devastating. I'd already lost my job because I'd been taking so much time off during the search, was surviving on savings and help from my mother. But protecting my daughters was worth any cost. They'd been through enough. They didn't need their trauma broadcast for public consumption. Glenn Murphy's trial came first. His defense argued he was coerced by Trevor, that the gambling debt had put him in an impossible position, that he'd never intended to harm the children. The prosecutor played the 911 recordings, showed the jury the abandoned building where Glenn had kept two small children locked in a room for nearly a week, presented Maya's testimony about how Glenn had threatened them, how he'd denied them adequate food, how Sophie had cried for her mother every night while Glenn told her to shut up, how he'd kept them in a room with one dirty mattress, no bathroom, and only buckets for toilets, how he'd made them eat fast food once a day and drink water from gallon jugs he'd bring up the 9 stairs to their prison. The jury saw photos of the room, filthy, dark, terrifying for adult prisoners, let alone small children. They heard recordings of Maya describing how cold it had been at night, how Sophie had gotten sick and Glenn had refused to get her medicine, how they'd held each other and sung their song to stay brave. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, found Glenn guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years, said anyone who would participate in holding children captive for money had forfeited their right to freedom. Glenn had shown no remorse, no understanding of the trauma he'd caused. He'd treated Maya and Sophie as objects, as means to an end, as bargaining chips in a financial transaction. During the sentencing hearing, Glenn's mother testified that her son had always been troubled, that he'd grown up in poverty and made bad choices. The judge acknowledged the difficult circumstances but noted that many people grew up poor without kidnapping children. Glenn's choices were his own. His consequences were deserved. The Trevor's trial was more complex. His defense team tried every angle: the unfair custody arrangement, the gambling addiction as a mental illness, the financial pressure from his debts. His lawyer painted him as a desperate man who'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of weakness. The prosecutor dismantled that narrative systematically, showed the 6 months of planning, the deliberate debt accumulation, the careful selection of an accomplice willing to commit serious crimes, the lack of any attempt to verify his daughter's safety during the week they'd been missing. Trevor had gone to Canada and enjoyed himself, had stayed in hotels, eaten at restaurants, posted photos on social media showing him drinking at bars and visiting tourist attractions while his children were imprisoned in an abandoned factory. The judge allowed testimony about Trevor's history with Maya and Sophie. I testified about his minimal involvement in their lives, his missed visitations, his broken promises, his anger when confronted about his failures, his threats during the divorce. The prosecutor established a pattern of behavior showing Trevor viewed the girls as possessions, as tools to hurt me, not as people he loved or wanted to protect. Maya testified via closed-circuit video, described how Daddy had told them they were going on an adventure, how he'd promised it would be fun, how he'd handed them over to a stranger and driven away without looking back, how she'd asked if they were coming home and he'd said eventually but wouldn't say when, how he'd hugged them and said he loved them right before leaving them with Glenn. The jury saw a man who'd used his own children as pawns, who'd prioritized erasing his gambling debts over their safety, who'd planned their abduction months in advance while attending custody hearings and pretending to fight for parenting time. The guilty verdict was unanimous. The judge gave him 30 years with no possibility of parole for 15. Said Trevor had betrayed the most fundamental duty of a parent: protection. He'd done the opposite, had deliberately endangered his children for personal gain, had caused them psychological harm that would last for years if not their entire lives, had shown no remorse even when confronted with the consequences of his actions. Trevor's rights as a parent were terminated permanently. He would never see Maya and Sophie again, never have any contact with them, never have any say in their lives. The judge made it clear that Trevor had forfeited every privilege that came with fatherhood the moment he'd handed his daughters to a criminal and walked away. The aftermath was complicated. Maya and Sophie needed extensive therapy. Maya handled it better than Sophie initially. She'd felt empowered by figuring out how to communicate through the song, felt proud that her cleverness had helped police find them. But nightmares came later. Panic attacks when I had to leave them with anyone. Hypervigilance about locked doors and unfamiliar places. She started having trouble at school. Couldn't concentrate. Got into fights when other kids asked about what happened. Her teacher was patient but concerned. Suggested homeschooling temporarily. I enrolled both girls in an online program. Kept them home where I could monitor them constantly, where they felt safe. Sophie was younger and understood less about what had happened. She just knew Daddy had taken them somewhere scary and left them with a mean man. She stopped singing for months, wouldn't even hum. Music had been tainted by association with the worst week of her life. Her therapist worked on reclaiming positive associations, played gentle music during sessions, encouraged Sophie to make simple sounds without pressure to perform or communicate. Progress was slow. Some weeks she'd seem better, would dance a little to music on TV. Then she'd have a setback, a nightmare, a random trigger, and withdraw again. The therapist said healing wasn't linear, that we needed to be patient with the process. I had my own trauma to process. The guilt was suffocating. I'd been so annoyed by their song. Had told them to stop singing it dozens of times. Had called it their annoying pickle jar thing. Had threatened to ban singing in the car if they didn't stop. If I'd paid more attention, would I have understood sooner? Would I have realized they were trying to communicate something? Detective Vega told me that was irrational guilt. Said there was no way I could have known the song would become a distress signal. That I'd done everything right by documenting Trevor's behavior and pursuing the custody modification. That his actions were his alone and not my responsibility. But the weight remained. I'd let my daughters go with their father because a court order said I had to. And he'd used that mandated access to betray them in the worst possible way. My mother stayed with us for 3 months. Helped with the girls while I tried to find work. Attended therapy appointments. Dealt with legal proceedings. I couldn't have managed without her. She'd cook meals, help with homeschool lessons, sit with Maya during her panic attacks, rock Sophie when she had nightmares. My mother had her own guilt about not pushing harder for me to leave Trevor sooner, about not seeing how dangerous he'd become. We'd sit together after the girls were asleep and talk about all the warning signs we'd missed, all the moments where different choices might have prevented this. The therapist said that kind of analysis was natural, but ultimately unhelpful, that we couldn't change the past, could only work on healing and moving forward. The civil lawsuit came next. My lawyer filed against both Trevor and Glenn seeking damages for the trauma inflicted on Maya and Sophie. Trevor had no assets. His apartment had been abandoned, his car seized by police, his bank accounts empty. But Glenn owned property, had savings from his various criminal enterprises. The civil judgment was in our favor. $700,000 to be split between the girls and held in trust until they turned 18. It wouldn't undo the trauma, but it would pay for their therapy, their education, give them something tangible from the nightmare they'd survived. Glenn's lawyer filed appeals, but they were denied. The judgment stood. The media coverage was intense. The story had everything: cute kids, clever rescue, evil father, brave mother. The pickle jar song became famous. News outlets played the 911 recordings, analyzed the lyrics. Experts discussed how children communicate during trauma. Maya and Sophie's faces were everywhere. I fought to protect their privacy, but it was impossible. We became public property, the family with the song. People recognized us at the grocery store, wanted to tell us how brave the girls were, how smart, how lucky we were that it ended well. Some people meant well, others were invasive, asked detailed questions about what happened, wanted to know how the girls were coping, whether they'd recovered, whether they hated their father. Every interaction was exhausting. Every reminder reopened wounds. A victims advocacy group reached out offering support, connected us with other families who'd experienced parental abduction. The stories were heartbreaking. Children taken to foreign countries, hidden for years. Some never recovered. We attended support group meetings. Maya and Sophie met other kids who'd been through similar trauma. Hearing that they weren't alone helped. Meeting children who'd survived and were building normal lives gave them hope. The groups also helped me. Talking with other parents who understood the particular horror of having your co-parent become your child's abductor, who knew the guilt and rage and helplessness, who didn't judge me for missing signs or making mistakes. We were all just surviving, trying to help our children heal while healing ourselves. We moved to a new city 6 months after the trials ended, changed our last names legally, started over in a place where no one knew our story, where Maya and Sophie could be regular kids instead of the girls from the news. I found work at a marketing firm, enrolled the girls in a small private school with excellent counseling services. We rented a house with a fenced yard and security system, built routines that felt safe and predictable. Slowly, very slowly, normal life emerged from the chaos. Maya started opening up about her experience in therapy. Talked about how scared she'd been when Daddy left them with Glenn. How she'd had to be brave for Sophie, who was younger and more frightened. How she'd gotten the idea to put clues in their song when she overheard Glenn on the phone talking about making 911 calls. How she'd practiced the modified lyrics with Sophie. Made it into a game so her little sister wouldn't be too scared. How proud she'd felt when police came crashing through the door. How she'd known her plan had worked. The therapist said Maya had demonstrated remarkable resilience and intelligence, that her ability to think strategically under extreme stress was unusual, but that didn't mean she wasn't traumatized. The brave exterior masked deep wounds that would require years to heal. Sophie's recovery was different. She didn't want to talk about what happened, would shut down if anyone mentioned it. Her therapist used play therapy, let Sophie act out scenarios with dolls and toy houses. Gradually, Sophie started expressing her feelings through the play, showing how scared she'd been, how much she'd missed me, how Glenn had been mean and scary, how Maya had taken care of her. The therapist said that was progress, that Sophie was processing in her own way, that forcing her to talk before she was ready would be counterproductive. So we waited. Let her healing happen at her own pace. 2 years after the abduction, Sophie sang for the first time. We were at a friend's birthday party. Someone put on music. The other kids started dancing. Sophie stood at the edge watching. Then tentatively, so quietly I almost missed it, she started humming along. Not the pickle jar song, a different song, something current and happy. I cried watching her, tried to hide it so I wouldn't make her self-conscious. Her therapist said it was a breakthrough, that Sophie had reclaimed music as something separate from her trauma, that she was ready to start rebuilding that part of herself. We celebrated quietly at home. I told Sophie how proud I was, how brave she'd been. She smiled and sang a little more, just a few lines, but it was everything. Maya became interested in criminology, started reading books about forensic psychology, cold cases, investigative techniques. She said she wanted to help find missing children when she was older, wanted to use her experience to make a difference. Her school counselor said it was a healthy way to process trauma, turning pain into purpose. But they'd also monitor to make sure it didn't become obsessive, that Maya was building a future rather than staying trapped in the past. For now, her interests seemed balanced, one part of her life among many. She had friends, activities, did well in school. The darkness hadn't consumed her. 3 years after the abduction, I met someone, a man named Daniel who knew nothing about our past. We met at work, started as friends. He was patient and kind when I explained I had baggage. 2 daughters who'd been through trauma, an ex-husband in prison, a complicated history I wasn't ready to fully discuss. Daniel said everyone had a past, that he was interested in who I was now, not where I'd been. We took it slow. Dated for months before I introduced him to the girls. Maya was suspicious at first, asked pointed questions about his intentions. Daniel answered honestly, said he cared about me and wanted to get to know them, that he'd go at whatever pace they were comfortable with. Maya eventually warmed up. Sophie liked him immediately. He never pushed, never tried to be their father, just a steady, kind presence in our lives. The criminal justice system had done its job, but healing required more than verdicts. Required therapy and time and patience and love. Required building new memories to balance the traumatic ones. Required teaching the girls that most adults were trustworthy even though their father had betrayed them. Required helping them understand that what happened wasn't their fault. That they'd been victims of adult choices and failures. That their intelligence and courage had saved them, but they shouldn't have needed saving in the first place. The responsibility belonged to Trevor. To Glenn. To the systems that hadn't protected them adequately. Not to 2 small children who'd done everything right while the adults around them failed catastrophically. We built a new life from the rubble of the old one. Found safety in routine and structure. Celebrated small victories. Maya's first sleepover without panic attacks. Sophie's first solo performance in the school musical. My first full night of sleep without nightmares. Daniel's proposal after 2 years of dating. His patient integration into our family. His love for all 3 of us. Recovery wasn't linear, but it was real. Some days were hard. Anniversaries of the abduction triggered setbacks. News stories about missing children caused panic attacks. But between the hard days were good ones. Normal ones. Days where we laughed and played and forgot to be afraid. 5 years after the abduction, Trevor was killed in prison. Stabbed by another inmate during a fight. The prison officials called to notify me as his ex-wife. Asked if I wanted information about his remains. I said no. Asked them not to contact me again. Told the girls that evening. Maya said good. Sophie cried and I wasn't sure why. Her therapist said Sophie was grieving the father she'd wished she had, not the one who'd betrayed her. That even monsters are mourned by the children who loved them before understanding what they were. We held a small private ceremony. Not a funeral, just the 3 of us acknowledging that part of our story was over. That Trevor couldn't hurt us anymore, couldn't contact us from prison, couldn't appeal his conviction, couldn't ever try to justify what he'd done. It was finished. Glenn Murphy remained in prison, had tried twice to appeal his conviction, both appeals denied. He'd be eligible for parole in 15 years. Detective Vega promised to notify us if his status changed, said she'd testify at any parole hearing about the conditions Maya and Sophie had endured, the psychological evaluations showing their trauma, the long-term effects of his actions. Glenn would serve every day of his sentence if she had anything to say about it. I was grateful for her continued advocacy, for her understanding that this case hadn't ended when the girls were found, that our family was still living with the consequences while Glenn sat in a cell thinking only about his own situation. 7 years after the abduction, Daniel and I got married. Small ceremony. Just close friends and family. Maya was our maid of honor. Sophie was flower girl. They'd both chosen to be part of the wedding, to celebrate this new chapter in our family's story. Daniel had been patient as we'd worked through complicated feelings about trust and commitment and what family meant after everything that had happened. He understood that we came as a package, that loving me meant loving my daughters and respecting their trauma and their healing. He'd never once complained about therapy appointments or panic attacks or the times when past overshadowed present. He was steady, safe, exactly what we needed. 10 years after the abduction, Maya graduated from college with a degree in forensic psychology. Sophie was performing with a regional theater company, working on her singing voice, finding joy in music again after years of silence. Both had built lives beyond their trauma, had relationships and dreams and futures that weren't defined by what Trevor had done to them. They'd participated in a documentary about parental abduction, spoke publicly about their experience, used their story to advocate for better custody protections and earlier intervention in domestic violence cases. They were strong and fierce and brilliant. Everything Trevor had tried to destroy had survived and grown stronger. We didn't talk about the pickle jar song much anymore. It lived in the past, a relic of the worst time in our lives. But sometimes when I was alone, I'd sing it quietly to myself. Pickle jar, 7 steps to the cookie star. And I'd remember 2 small girls who'd been clever enough and brave enough to save themselves when no one else could, who'd turned an annoying song into a lifeline, who'd refused to be silenced even when the adults holding them captive thought they'd been rendered powerless. Their voices had mattered, their song had been heard, and they'd come home. That song had been a gift disguised as an annoyance, a tool they'd created without knowing they'd need it, proof that children were capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. That survival sometimes looked like singing the same silly song until someone finally listened to what you were really saying. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.